I used to have the same relationship with Ben Shapiro that I had with Justin Bieber when I was a teenager, which was the fact that I did not like him. And the reason I didn't like him, just as I did not like Justin Bieber at the time, was because I was told I should not like him. It was as simple as that. It was just a popular thing not to like the guy until I actually listened to the guy. Now, unlike Bieber, it would be years later that I would actually come to appreciate some of his music. Whereas Ben Shapiro, it happened almost instantaneously because this man is as sharp as a tack. He is bright as a night daylight. Okay? This man simply understands what he is talking about. Whether you like him or not, he is deeply researched and he knows how to communicate a message. And the message I want to basically share with you guys today is one of essentially that dismantles the victimhood mindset. My purpose and my mission in this life is simple. It is to empower and it is to free as many from these mental shackles as humanly possible. It is simple as that. I'm on the same mission that Abraham Lincoln or Brother Frederick Douglass was on back in 1865, which is to abolish slavery, but not in the context that we have heard in history, but instead the current version, which is the psychological, the mental and emotional slavery that most of us have been enduring for far too long. And so that being said, I want to share this most recent video shared by a platform called Young Americans Foundation. And it's titled The Coalition of Losers. And again, this is a very unapologetic, say it as it is message, but I know you guys are going to enjoy it, especially those with some common sense and can think for themselves. It's going to cut through the surface. If you're somebody who is just so deeply conditioned into the propaganda machine, it's probably going to offend you, but you're still going to get value from it nevertheless. So with all further ado, let's get into it. Here is Ben Shapiro.
I want to thank the anonymous sponsor of the Things That Matter lecture series as well. So, listen, I have a lot of amazing memories from this particular campus. I originally came to this campus in the year 2000, so it's been quite a while. I was 16 at the time. And yeah, I have some great memories here. I met my wife right next door to this campus. We're off campus here. I used to bring her dinner at Powell Library while she was studying for her biology classes after I came back from law school. A lot of great things happened to me on this particular campus. I have a lot of fondness for this campus. And then I have some bad memories as well from this particular campus. So back in 2002, I used to write for the UCLA Daily Bruin. What actually got me into politics was the craziness of this campus. When I first came to UCLA at the age of 16, I thought I was going to double major in music. I was a fairly good violinist at the time. I was going to double major in music and biology. And none of those two things came true because I was walking down Bruin Walk and I picked up a copy of the Daily Bruin, and there was an editorial comparing Ariel Sharon, then the Prime Minister of Israel, to Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi. And I promptly walked into the UCLA Daily Bruin offices and asked if I could write a counter. And at the time they said yes. That turned into a regular column, which turned into eventually my syndicated column. But the reason I stopped writing for the UCLA Daily Bruin is of some note. So this is back in 2002. I had submitted, I think, 35 columns or so while I was writing for the UCLA Daily Bruin. And all of them had been accepted, except for two. And they were on the exact same topic. Every other column I wrote, and it was some pretty provocative stuff, like stuff I would not write today. And there were two columns specifically that they rejected, and they were both on the exact same topic. And that was the radicalism of the Muslim Student Association on campus. They would not allow me to write this. They would not allow me to write or quote the Muslim news magazine on campus, which at the time, I don't know what it's called now, it's called Al-Talib at the time. That Muslim news magazine happened to be so radical that it had joked just before September 11th about changing the name of the magazine to Al-Taliban and making Osama bin Laden editor-in-chief. It was unfortunate timing, but yeah, they didn't want me writing about any of this stuff. They didn't want me writing about the fact that the MSA had nationally fundraised for organizations with terror ties. And eventually, after they refused to publish these columns, I went public with that, and they ended up firing me from the Daily Bruin in fairly public fashion. That was all the way back in 2002. And it turns out that not much changed, because you fast forward about 12 years, and that was kind of my next big moment on this campus. It was in this very room, actually. There's a big hearing. Before all of your times, there's a big hearing here, it was a decade ago, about boycott, divestment, and sanctions from the state of Israel. And my wife and I were living in the Valley at the time. Now we have fled this god-awful state for the warmer climes of Florida, a free country. And we started getting notifications that this hearing was not going well, that people were getting up and lying about what Israel was doing, that there was a lot of anti-Semitism that was being evinced in the room. And so we had just had our first baby. I turned to my wife and I said, here, sweetheart, hold the baby. I'm going to get in our crappy Honda Accord and I'm going to drive over the hill and I'm going to come here. And I came in here and I went to the front of the line and I proceeded to deliver a bit of a 2-minute diatribe about why BDS was anti-Semitic, which it is. And the diatribe was very simple. It went something like this. The only reason that you give a damn about what Israel is doing is because it's filled with Jews. There's a whole set of countries all over the Middle East that are constantly engaging in the worst human rights atrocities on planet Earth. You don't seem to have a word for them. You don't seem to have a word about the atrocities committed by Hamas. You don't seem to have a word about the atrocities committed by the Palestinian Authority or Islamic Jihad. The only people you seem to care about are the Jews, and that's for one reason and one reason only, and that's because you don't like Jews. And this went fairly viral. They ended up voting down BDS. That time, of course, later, the student government would go ahead and vote in favor of BDS. So nothing has changed since 2014. And then, of course, there was last year when we all sort of watched agog as the administration simply allowed the Tentifada to take place on campus. People blocking off the quad because apparently they experience a certain joy at living in their own feces. And I understand this is California, and that's actually like a cherished way of life here, but still.
He is not being sarcastic. I still live in California, actually, but far removed from the political epicenter, which is known as the Bay Area, a.k.a. The world of the living dead. So if you guys have not heard the news, much of the Bay Area has turned into an absolute wasteland. And I don't mean that as hyperbolically, as they would say. I mean that in the most literal sense. It has turned into a hole where people are allowed to defecate on the streets and get away with it. I say allowed because they're getting away with it. So you will walk down the sunny side San Francisco streets and you will find yourself probably stepping in human feces at some point in your personal San Francisco journey.
Blocking students from actually accessing places like Powell Library, places of which I have fond memories, and the school doing absolutely nothing. And then finally, after the Tentifada is cleared, 800 University of California faculty and staff demanding actually, that all legal charges be dropped and amnesty be granted to all students, staff, and faculty who were involved in the encampment in peaceful protests. Peaceful would be a euphemism there for totally not particularly peaceful. So the reason I'm retelling these stories is because not much has changed. I wrote a book, again, 20 years ago now, 2004, called Brainwashed, How Universities Indoctrinate America's Youth. And it was all about UCLA. If you go back and read the book now, it's quoting professors who are still working at UCLA. The only thing that has changed is that it's just gotten significantly worse and significantly more open. At the time, I was mentioning something that not a lot of people knew about. Now, of course, everybody knows about this. And it is wide open and it is very clear. And so the question becomes, why did it become so much worse? And the answer is that this university, among other universities, has decided to coddle an entire generation of losers. An entire coalition of losers. And it is a coalition. It is a group of groups that have decided, for various reasons, really only one reason, to associate with one another. People who would never get along in regular life, except they share one thing, and that is hatred of the system. Take, for example, Queers for Palestine, the most self-contradictory group in the history of all groups. It's chickens for KFC. It makes zero sense, of course, because whatever queers there are in Palestine are no longer alive, having been thrown off roofs. But what exactly is behind all of that? Well, it actually is pretty simple. People who believe that they are members of victimized, marginalized groups get together and decide that they are going to tear down the system from within. That is the most important thing. It doesn't matter if members of these various groups actually want to kill one another. The most important thing is that the system in which they live is terrible and awful. And so what you get is some of the most privileged, obnoxious people on earth hanging out with each other in places where they would never hang out with one another, simply to yell at the university, to yell at Jews, to yell at the United States, to yell at Western civilization, to talk about how they have occupied native land and all the rest of this sort of trash. And whenever people, by the way, give land acknowledgments, the first question you should ask is, so why don't you give it back? Like anytime, you're right here. You can't float 3 feet above the earth. So if you want to give it back, like your apartment is now available to any person who is of a heritage that is older than yours in this country. So what exactly does this coalition of losers, scavengers, and they're scavengers. What we are in right now in the United States and in Western civilization generally is a battle between what I call the lions and the scavengers, people who actually like to produce, people who wish to build social fabric, people who wish to fight for central principles of Western civilization, and people who only care about tearing all of those things down. So what is it that they believe? What unites them? Well, there are really three basic beliefs that unite them. Belief number one is that there is no such thing as a duty you owe to other people. There is just the stuff you want. More than anything else, what you want is what matters. Who you are is a series of wants, in fact, and anyone who denies you those wants is in some way oppressing and exploiting you. That is belief number one. Belief number two is that all disparity equals discrimination.
And oftentimes, more often than not, the wants are things that everybody else has, i.e. the spirit of entitlement. I want what you have. Bad, bad, rich man. You need to give your money to me. That's really what it's about. And I used to think these individuals cared so much about the social nucleus, about humanity and bringing us all together. Until I realized this, that all they're actually speaking or projecting out is based upon what they want for themselves. And this is an example I oftentimes use. I say, if you want to find out what somebody truly values, if it's the community or really what they want, give $100 bills to everybody. Like, give the reparations to everybody in their neighborhood, the entire community except for them, and see how they respond. If they are still dissatisfied and unhappy, it shows that it wasn't about everybody else. It was simply about themselves. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Everything starts at an individual level, but we have to be honest about it. This psychology comes from a place of hatred, of envy, jealousy, and it projects out a lot of its own insecurities onto those who have the things that they truly desire. It is a thirst for power over others. To cancel somebody, how dare you for thinking for yourself? You need to fall in line. And if you don't, we're going to attack you. We're going to ridicule you. We're going to, tear you to shreds because we don't want you to continue to point back to us the things we are most insecure about. But what do I know?
That is belief number one. Belief number two is that all disparity equals discrimination. That if there is a disparity between groups along any lines, that must be the result of exploitation and discrimination. So if one group is economically underperforming, it's not because members of that group, for example, have a higher single motherhood rate, or their kids study less, or anything like that. It must instead be that the system is built in order to exploit that oppressed group of people. In this matrix, failure equals victimization, and success equals victimizer.
That is so powerful. Wow. As soon as you step out of that mold, like even for myself, once I stepped out of that victimhood complex of because I'm black, I'm not, able to succeed, I can't do this and that. Once I stepped out of that, all of a sudden I became the problem to those who, had the same kind of belief systems that I once held. Those who had that same self-perpetuated victimhood would now see me as the oppressor. I was now a white supremacist because I was no longer in alignment with struggle and suffering and everything else that they pretty much held at the highest value system. Because the greater of a victim that you are in that system, the better of a human being that you are, and the more caring that you are. Unless you don't agree with me, then you are the enemy.
If you are a success, if you have succeeded in life, it's because you must have necessarily, by definition, exploited someone. You did something wrong. You hurt somebody. And finally, there's a third principle, and that is that if there is any group that is both victimized and successful, that group does not exist. It's not real. So if you were to look at, for example, Asian Americans, historically victimized in the United States, disproportionately educationally successful, they're no longer Asian. They're now white adjacent. They don't count because you cannot have a group that violates the rules. Any group that is successful is a victimizer. So if you can identify a group that is successful and that is not a victimizer and is, in fact, disproportionately a victim group, that group does not exist. Jews, therefore, are white. Asians are white adjacent. Okay, these are the...
I've even heard folks say, well, rich black people are nothing more than the system of white supremacy. And I'm like, okay, so you can't win this battle. You can't win this. It's not an argument to be had. It's not a debate to be had because the person is already bought into their own helplessness. Simple as that. You can point out everybody in their entire community could be somebody that is prospering who looks like them, and they will still find a way to make an excuse about it. I saw this. It's actually in a video that I did with Officer Tate. What was it called? Black officer something exposes blah 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 whatever. And in it, in essence, this young man who's on a college campus, young black man, is going on about, systemic racism, etc. This is a guy who's on a college campus, easily paying $30,000 to $40,000 a year for his education, and still trying to, surrounded by other black students, complaining about, the injustices and, the lack of opportunity for black folk, and can't even see himself as a contradiction of the very thing that he is touting. That's how deep that psychology is. It's a religion, it's a cult, and it's a mind parasite.
These are the beliefs that bind together this coalition of losers. So exactly who is in the coalition of losers? There's a few categories in the coalition of losers. Some of them are imports. So there are a group of foreign students who are sponsored from abroad who come here and don't like American values very much, who don't like private property, who don't like Western civilization, who don't like free speech, who don't like Judeo-Christian values, and who believe that they are the voice of the colonized and are therefore here to tear away at the system. There are some of those people. And there's good data to suggest that many of the protests that we've been seeing on campus are actually sponsored from abroad. An official of Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist group, the Iranian front group, recently admitted that they have been funding student protests from abroad via front groups. Again, that's nothing new. This has been happening for decades. Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, confirms that some of these protests have been funded by Iran. There's nothing new here. It just used to be that in the United States, we didn't tolerate that sort of thing. It used to be that in the United States, if you came here, we had a general rule. You have to like the place.
Yeah, imagine that, as an immigrant, a legal immigrant, moved here in 2007, I still have family members to this day, almost 20 years later, that are still looking to get their way into this country legally, right? To get the paperwork necessary, etc. Why would people be fighting to get into a country or stay in a country which was so terrible? Like, I never could understand that aspect. I was never a person who said, I'm going to leave America. America's so terrible. Even when I was pretty far left leaning, I still never got to that point. I couldn't understand how, if it's so terrible here, then why stay? Why continue to be, quote unquote, oppressed, etc.? And I hear folks saying, I'm going to go back to Africa. And I'm like, some of y'all, you probably wouldn't survive 2 hours over there. You know what I mean? As soon as the electricity goes out somewhere, there is no electricity to begin with. And, your little conveniences are gone and out of sight. There is no Wi-Fi. You got to go somewhere remote or whatever it is to just have like the most simple basic needs met. Yeah, you're probably going to make your way right back here and continue to complain about how oppressive it is and how, we're the reason why things are the way they are over there. It's just really, it's actually incredible. And I'm going to call it what it is. It's a form of insanity.
And if you don't like the place, you can go. You can leave. And if you won't leave, we will make you leave.
This is how AI optimizes my schedule.
And this is how I move all the way past that ad.
Then there are the Marxists. These are the people who feel truly dispossessed in literally the richest nation in the history of the world. People who believe that they are victimized as they tweet from their iPhone 16s. People who believe that capitalism is a rapacious system of wealth destruction as they shop at Gucci. Right? Those are the people who occupy this campus, largely. Many of them are in the...
It's always the funniest thing to me when I see the socialists or the anti-capitalists who literally, their entire lives are a representation of nothing more than capitalism. But again, if it makes you feel better about yourself, well, still don't do it. Because, it's not going to be very helpful for anybody on either side. You just got a package from Amazon, but you're complaining about, the rich billionaires who control the planet and are keeping the masses suppressed. But you just bought another one of their products. Just visited a grocery store and bought more Lay's potato chips as opposed to growing your own potato. But what do I know?
Largely, many of them are in the professoriate, being paid rich taxpayer-sponsored salaries to teach absolute trash and random nonsense in careers that would not exist outside of their various departments. I'm looking at you, sociology. These Marxists do not like the West. They think that capitalism is the root of all evil, and they are willing to ally with just about anyone if it means they get to tear away at what they believe is the capitalist infrastructure. So that is another group. So you have imports, you have Marxists, then you have the transgressives. These are folks who feel marginalized in their own personal lives. These are people who believe that the traditional structures, things like family and church, these are oppressive institutions that demand things of them that they don't want to give, and therefore the system has victimized them, and they have to tear it down too. Queers for Palestine would fall into exactly this group. The transgressives, I'm not calling them progressives because they're not actually progressing toward anything. The entire point of being a transgressive is that you must find the next line to transgress. Because in order for you to feel truly free, in order for you to be an autonomous individual, you cannot have the imposition of any rule or any institution. You have to tear away at every rule and every institution. So you have to go in search of things that oppress you and then tear them down. That is another part of the coalition of losers. And then finally, you have the racialists. These are people who deeply desire to divide Americans not by individual identity, but by group identity. Identify people in the United States simply by dint of racial group. In the United States, these would be people represented by the likes of the much celebrated and ballyhooed complete moron Ta-Nehisi Coates, a person who is so racialist in his outlook that he once suggested that as he watched 9/11 happen, stoned from the top of a Brooklyn building, he felt nothing because they were not human to him, because they're representatives of the white superstructure in the United States. That is a person who is seen as a moral clarion call by the racialists and by much of the left-wing media, and indeed on campus. I'm sure many of you have been assigned his trash books in your class. Now, of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates has written a new trash book. He comes out with one every 10 years or so. After visiting a place for 2 weeks, he decides he knows everything there is to know about that place, and then proceeds
And it's amazing to me because some will be offended by him saying he writes these trash books, yet this is a man who literally said he felt nothing for people who lost their lives within that terroristic attack. Isn't that something? We get offended off all the wrong, like the craziest things. It really shows you it's not about love and compassion and acceptance. It has nothing to do with that. Because if you do not agree with their aligned belief, if you just deviate from it, you are ridiculed, you are attacked, you are slandered, and you are no longer a part of the club. If you deviate in thought, that is a cult, my friends.
and then proceeds to write a book about how it turns out everything complex is actually crystal clear. He writes in that book about his father. He's talking about the Palestinians and the Israelis. He says, I remember watching World News Tonight with my father and deriving from him a dull sense that the Israelis were white and the Palestinians were black, which is to say that the former were the oppressors and the latter the oppressed. This is a great thinker in the modern age, Ta-Nehisi Coates. So this coalition of losers only have one thing in common, because really they violate each other's rules. If you were looking at imported radical fundamentalist Muslims from the Middle East, for example, and you are saying, what do they have in common with transgressives? The answer is nothing, except they don't like the system. If you're looking at the Marxists, and you say, what do those people have in common with fundamentalist Muslims? The answer is not a whole hell of a lot, but they have in common the thing they want to tear down. They are scavengers, in other words. Now, society is not built on scavengers. Society is built on the back of lions. Okay, lions are a different type of human being. Okay, anybody can be a lion, by the way. When I say this, and when I say they're a different type of person, I mean people make themselves one or the other. You make yourself in your life the choice between being a lion or being a scavenger. Lions are people who build. Lions are people who defend the civilization that has given them everything. Lions are people who innovate. Right? Lions are providers, people who actually want to take us to the stars, people who generate new products, people who go to work every day and put food on the table for their families because they're increasing the amount of good in the world. They're using their labor and their productivity and their brains and their innovation to make the world a better place for everyone. Right? Those are providers, and they are lions. And then there are warriors, people who are out there on the front lines actually defending the things that truly matter. In this note, by the way, I want to thank law enforcement for being here tonight and making this possible. It's a great tragedy in the United States that so few Americans know members of the military these days, because members of the military, the people who are actually out on the front lines protecting Americans' freedoms, those people are absolute warriors, and they deserve, obviously, not only our support, but our love and our undying respect. And I will say this, not just warriors on behalf of the United States, but warriors on behalf of the West in general. I had the experience fairly recently, it was back in June, of visiting Israel in the middle of this war. And I happened to be sitting during one of the afternoon prayers next to a 20-year-old who had just lost both of his legs, one arm, and two of his fingers on the other hand in the war in Gaza. A 20-year-old kid, American parents, and he had, they were going house to house in Gaza. An IED had exploded a building, killed many of his compatriots, and he'd been gravely wounded. And he turned to me, he'd listened to the show, he turned to me right before I left davening, and he said, Ben, I listened to the show, I really appreciate what you do, which is really, upsetting, because when somebody gives their limbs for Western civilization, talking for a living doesn't quite do it. And he said, what more can I do? That is the mentality of warriors all over Western civilization. And then there are the weavers, right? These are the people who weave together the social fabric. These are parents who set standards for their children. These are teachers who teach.
One of the least valued positions and yet the most important. Without the weavers, and he's going to go into detail of that, without the family nucleus, without the mother, the father, and the household, cultivating literally the next generation of human beings. Without that, there is no civilization. And yet that is being belittled, it's being demeaned, it's being seen as a lower or a lesser. Like I remember, I have my own little story, Ben. I got my own story. There was a time when, I don't remember the context of the event. I think it might have been like I used to do these like Hamilton performances or whatever and get paid a cool amount of change just to like look like a Hamilton guy and, and do my little performative thing. And I was talking to some of the people after, that's what it was. And there was three women who, probably middle-aged white women who I was going back and forth with. And, they were talking about, two of them were talking about their jobs and their this and their that. And one woman was pretty quiet the entire time. And I asked, oh, what do you do? And she's like, oh, I used to do blah, 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 but now I'm just, stay-at-home mother. And I looked at her, and eventually the two other women left. And I was like, do you know how important that job? Like, do you understand that's the most important job? And I just saw her light up in that moment. She was so embarrassed to just say, I'm, now a stay-at-home mother. She had to put all the other attributes on top of it in front of these other women to feel like she was adequate or, somebody. And I'm like, that's mind-blowing that we've gotten so far in our society to where we can't even value the most valuable aspects of life. We're told that crunching numbers is more important than raising children. That is crazy.
Who teach kids actual values as opposed to the morally relativistic trash that they are taught at this university, or teach small kids that boys can be girls and girls can be boys. That people. These are the members of community who do charity work, right? These are the people who actually build a civilization. And what they believe, they have a system of belief too. It's the opposite of the system of belief of the scavengers. What they believe is that there is a logic to the universe and that we have an obligation to understand that logic. What does that mean? It means there's cause and effect. So that also happens to mean that success is very often within your control. Because if there's cause and effect, your own failures very often are your own fault. And your own successes are reliant on you making good decisions. Which brings us to principle number 2 that they believe, which is that choice is theirs. Agency is theirs. I know an enormous number of truly highly successful people.
They say this is the greatest differentiator between the miserable and the fulfilled. Is the belief of the difference between the level of agency that you have over your own life. Those who have a belief that they have little to no agency, little to no control within their lives are far more miserable than those who have the opposite belief and live in accordance to it, which makes perfect logical sense. If you believe that life is happening to you, that you can do nothing about your life circumstance, that you are a victim and things are happening perpetually that are simply out of any of your control, you can do nothing. You're going to feel miserable. You're going to feel powerless. And that's the conditioning. That's the propaganda that's been pushed into much of our generation, is to have us believe we simply can't do anything for ourselves and of our own. And so that leads to greater levels of anxiety, greater levels of depression, miserable sentiments, views of the world that are pessimistic, seeing the world as, kind of this evil thing that is against us, as opposed to something that we can build for ourselves. So this is such a valuable point. I believe the most important point, actually, of any point that could be made. It's what I stand on in my entire message, is the power is within us to make the change, to make the difference. We can do something. And it's further than just placing your vote in a ballot. It's about what you vote for with your time, energy, and attention every single day.
People. And this is the one thing they all have in common. Their level of understanding of their own agency is limitless. Limitless. They truly believe that everything is on their shoulders. If something goes wrong, they don't look at the outside world for reasons why they failed. They look in the mirror at how they can fix that problem. This is what lions do, and this is how problems get solved, as opposed to on campuses like this one, where people look at ills in the world and immediately attribute it to the world. Instead, these people look at the ills of the world and they say, how can I, in my personal life, change the world in such a way that I make the world a better place? These are the people who live, some of them very famous lives, and some of them very, very quiet lives. Lives of just building their community, and then they're buried by their family, and what goes on their gravestone is beloved wife or beloved mother or beloved husband or beloved son. And those people build community. And then finally, lions understand that there are duties that are outside you that rule you. You are not owed everything. You owe everything. You ought to be grateful for the civilization that you were given. There's a series of duties. Those duties were handed down to you by your ancestors, and you owe them to your children. Those duties were created by God, and you owe them to the people who are around you. And rights are a part of that. You have to be able to exercise rights and liberties within those duties, but specifically so you can fulfill those duties. This is what lions believe, and those are the people who build civilization. And that is the big clash that we've been seeing on campus over the course of the last year or so, but really over the course of the last several decades, just taking sort of ahead this year, coming to a head this year. And that, I think, is the conflict in Western civilization more broadly right now. Are we going to be a civilization of lions, or are we simply going to throw that out the window and tear down everything? Are we so enjoying our lifestyle of bitching and moaning amid the greatest wealth in human history that we are willing to tear down the system that built all of that?
There have never been better times in human history, documented, ever. And yet, we have never seen so much ungratefulness, complaining, and victimhood. It is really incredible. Again, I came from a so-called third world country, developing country, right? And even there, there's not even a comparison of the amount of just all out complaining and blaming and whining. That's why I think I shifted so radically and drastically from what I used to believe in. And I don't mean radically as far as my views. It's just like, I was like, I can't do this anymore. Is because it was just too much. Like the denseness of that energy is it will leave you disabled, unable to do anything. Because you're looking at the world as, again, this thing that is simply against you and you can do nothing about. You live in fear and in terror, and I couldn't do it, y'all. I couldn't do it. I had things in my life that I desired to create and to build. And with that deep, dark, dense energy, I couldn't do it. Simple as that. So we're going to finish up the last little bits of this wrap up. He's going to do a Q&A, but we're not going to get into that. Otherwise, we'll be here for the next 2.5 days. So
down the system that built all of that wealth, prosperity, health, or are we actually going to contribute? Because that's the choice, especially in front of young people. Are you going to be a useful person, or are you going to be a worse than useless person? Are you going to be a person who makes the most of the skills that God gave you and that you have a duty to develop? Or are you going to be a person who decides that it's your job in the name of social justice to tear down all the systems of merit that actually make the world a better place for yourself and for everybody else? Civilization is at a crossroads, and we're going to have to choose one, or we're going to have to choose the other. And so I hope that tonight, for those who disagree with some of what I say, at least we should be able to agree on one thing, that individual initiative, hard work, good, solid choices, decent virtues, membership in a community that matters. These are the things that are going to build up this country and make our civilization a better place, not the endless acidic cynicism that you see from the radical left on places like this campus. Thank you so much. Happy to take your questions.
I used to be afraid of the dark, a place unknown like a hardening heart. I used to see my life in the bar. Now the kids unchained, every shackle is lost. 2 steps in the moonlight, 2 step in the daytime. You just know when it feel right. You got a feeling the time's not. See you through those shades that I just threw on. Through my lenses, you just can't do no wrong. I fell in love with myself again. I fell in love with myself. I fell in love with the sunshine. I fell in love with the light. I fell in love with the full moon. I fell in love with the night. I can see the light again. I can see the light. You can see the life in him, but